Good afternoon. How's it going? True, false? I haven't been to this festival in about 5 or 6 years now. I came twice sort of in the first 5 years of the festival, and it's so exciting to be back. So thank you to the festival for having me back, and welcome to all of you. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Was anyone in the room for the previous panel discussion that happened just a little while ago? A couple of you. Well, this discussion, I think, will jump nicely off of that topic as we look at this kind of tension, maybe for lack of a better word. And I think panels are always better with tension, so I'll just throw the word tension out there. This tension between fiction and nonfiction in filmmaking. In the previous panel, it was how film critics, how journalists, and how writers sort of navigate the sometimes treacherous waters of writing about nonfiction film, and do they write about films differently when they're fiction films? What we'll talk about here with filmmakers is look at that from a different point of view, and that is how filmmakers, I think, use that tension to their, in my opinion, advantage in the way that they explore the kinds of stories they're going to tell, or the way they tell the stories themselves. There's one person missing from this panel. We're supposed to have 2 Sarahs on this panel, and we just have one. So playing the part of both Sarahs is Sarah Gavron. Gavron? How do you pronounce your last name?
Yeah, Gavron.
Gavron. Yeah. She made Village at the End of the World, and she is not Sarah Polley, but
sadly not.
If we play our cards right, she'll speak for Sarah Polley as well. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And on the other end of the panel here is a filmmaker who I've known for a long time and whose work I know well. I think I saw your short film. You told me about your short film.
Back when we were both much younger.
We were, yes, much. Josh Marston. Welcome, Josh Marston. Has anybody here seen, hopefully, I don't want to embarrass you if they haven't, Maria, who's seen Maria Full of Grace? Great. Well, that's just one film of Josh's that we'll talk about. But what I want to sort of start with, I thought it might be interesting to start with the question that's posed in the description of the panel, but I also actually want to kind of flip the question a little bit, and not so much take issue with how the panel is framed, but sort of challenge us to think about how the panel was framed. And in the description, page 91 it looks like, I'll just read the one sentence that's here, the 2 sentences. Revolving doors. Directors of narrative features are increasingly telling nonfiction stories. What tenets from the feature world do these directors bring into their documentaries? What can the world of narrative features, this is the question I want to focus on, what can the world of narrative features teach nonfiction filmmakers? And the way I want to flip that is not so much the idea that nonfiction filmmakers need to be taught by narrative filmmakers, but more so how the two are informing each other, I think is probably a way that I would like to frame this conversation. So what can they teach each other? What can narrative teach nonfiction? What can nonfiction teach narrative? How are filmmakers in each of those camps using techniques from both worlds? Or maybe the lines are a lot blurrier than we even need to distinguish, and that's something that came up in the previous panel. Maybe we shouldn't be so strict about nonfiction and fiction in the way we define movies. So that's a lot for me to throw out to start the conversation, but it's sort of the things that I'm thinking about as we go into this discussion, and we'll include your questions and comments along the way as well. Let me start with Sarah, because you have a background in, and you've kind of moved along this trajectory of fiction and nonfiction, but let's just start with the idea of, as a filmmaker, do you, if you're at a festival or you're out in the real world, outside of a festival, do you define yourself as a fiction filmmaker, a narrative filmmaker? Do you use these terms to define yourself as a director, as a filmmaker?
I think I do, actually. My history is that I began in documentary. I went to a small film school to do an MA and began in...
Where was this?
That was at Edinburgh College of Art after I did an English degree. Then I went to and did a few shorts.
It's not in the States, apparently. I'm just guessing.
No, Scotland, and in Britain. And then I decided I wanted to make documentaries, but I didn't know how to do it. So I worked at a production company for free. I knocked on doors, essentially, and worked for 5 weeks at a production company for free, researching documentaries. And I worked so hard that they had to give me a job because I just never left.
But
and
why did you want to work in documentaries specifically at that point?
Because I wanted to, I think at that point, when I was 22, I wanted to change the world.
A couple years ago.
just a couple of years ago, 20 years ago. I wanted to change the world. I think that was what I thought I could do in documentaries. I thought I could make films that would make people realize that they had to change the ways they were doing things.
And documentary was going to be the way to do that?
That was going to be the way,
okay.
Yeah. And so then they gave me a job researching a documentary about the miners' strike. You know, Thatcher had brutally, in '84, killed all the unions. And so I was sent up to Yorkshire, and it was terrifying, you know, met all these burly miners and had this very scary experience, but learnt a lot and worked on this documentary. I wasn't the director, I was a researcher. And then I carried on and I got a job at the BBC, and I worked for 4 years in documentaries at the BBC. And I got sent all over the world, went to India, Pakistan and Bangladesh as a researcher and then as an AP, and finally doing bits of directing. But I was never in control of the film. It was always being commissioned by someone else, and I wasn't the primary director. So I wasn't really, I'd find all these interesting things, but they wouldn't end up on television. The films that would end up on television were these sort of packaged films that I always felt a little bit disappointed by. So I decided that I wanted to go to film school and do more my own projects. So I applied for the National Film and Television School because I thought that was a way, I couldn't see another way actually to sort of be free and make films. And at the time it was free to go there in England, and you got a bursary, so it was an option for me. So I went there for 3 years, but at the last minute I applied to do documentary. I filled out my application form, and the night before I sent it in, I changed it to fiction because I suddenly thought, hang on a minute, I think I want to do that. So it was a bit random really. But then I went to film school and realized, my God, I'm learning about actors.
Wait, I want to hear more about
my life story here.
No, but I want to hear more about why you switched that
to make
check
money.
Mark. Was it a financial thing? Was it a creative thing? Was it just a word?
It was what you hadn't done up until then, probably.
It was what I hadn't done, and also they asked you to come up with a proposal in the application. And I was forcing myself to come up with this documentary proposal about my grandmother, but actually I was more interested in making a fiction about her, sort of based loosely on her. So then I thought, okay, well maybe I'm just applying for the wrong course, you know. So I switched, and I actually think for me at that point I did the right thing. And I think I'm one of those split personalities that will move between fiction and documentary. So, you know, there are many people, and many of my friends who are firm documentary makers or firm fiction makers, but I am genuinely interested in both. And every project, I'm doing one about the suffragette movement at the moment, which is a fiction film, but it's based on memoirs, and that's really research-based, and I'm very interested in the truth of it. And so, but I'll let someone who speak.
And that leads me to a question for Josh that picks up on some of what you were just talking about. If we look at Maria Full of Grace or Forgiveness of Blood, to me, as a viewer, there's a lot of truth, or what I anticipate to be, or I expect to be a certain amount of truth in not just the setting, but in the characters and in the way they're revealed, and in some of the core aspects of their lives in these two films. Josh, how do you think about this, the sort of limits that are placed either upon a creative person, a filmmaker, or on the expectations of an audience when they're told this is a documentary about a particular place or person or subject versus this is a narrative film? Or do you think about that?
It's interesting. It's a fine line between telling an audience this is something real, and before they go and see a movie, which might make someone really excited to go see something that they're going to be immersed in, versus this is I don't know what the word you might use, but this is something where you're going to learn something about something, and suddenly someone says, "Oh, I don't want to see that. That sounds like schoolwork." And probably that's one of the stigmas that documentaries have upon them is this notion that, oh, we're going to have to learn something, we're going to have to use our brains, and we're not going to be drawn into some fictional environment whereas a fiction film is going to remove us from our cares of the everyday world. I think for me, you know, and I'm actually, the line of my career at this point is drawn by the two dots that create it, because I've only made 2 movies, so 2 feature films. And if you look at them, you'd say, oh, well, that's what he does. He makes realist movies in faraway places in languages other than English, which is why he has no money. But there's a lot of other things that I want to do, and among the ways you could draw distinctions between fiction and documentary would be that nonfiction filmmakers seem to work more, which is one of the great temptations of nonfiction. But for me, the reason why I've ended up making those kinds of movies is that one of the things that's most fascinating to me about making a movie is this process of discovery, where I read about something, some aspect of some world, and I say, oh, I can see immediately what the crux of a narrative would be, what the question would be, what the motor of a storyline would be, and I want to go then and learn more. I want to interview people, I want to hear people's stories, and it becomes an excuse for me to go out into the world and play anthropologist. Before I came to filmmaking, I spent a bit of time figuring out what I wanted to do, and I was an intern in the world of journalism, and I was an intern in the world of diplomacy at the American Embassy in Paris. It was incredibly boring. I spent a couple of years really unhappy in a political science graduate program, and ultimately ended up in film as always, but I was always looking for some way to bring all of these interests together. And so for me, roundabout way of answering your question is that when I go into one of these projects, it's not so much the interest of educating an audience, although I would say it is the interest of bringing an audience into a world, but it is also out of the selfish interest of entering the world myself. Because what ends up happening, and Sarah just alluded to it as well, is that there are these volumes of stories and information that you get that then don't make it into the movie. And it's all a lot of fun for me, but I often think, gee, then I do a Q&A and I start telling all these stories, and people's jaws drop because there's all this other stuff that didn't make it into the movie. I'm rambling, so.
Did you have a similar, to Sarah, did you have like a checkbox moment where you sort of grappled with the idea of going in one direction or the other because of your training, your background, not training, but your background is unique and would have or could have or still could uniquely position you to kind of spin off in a nonfiction filmmaking route. You chose to go in a different one. Did you have that kind of fork in the road moment?
I think it's here.
You're having it this weekend?
I'm not being entirely facetious. I mean, part of the reason why, I mean, I reached out to David Wilson and said, I've heard about this festival. I want to come to this festival because I want to do more documentary work, and I want to immerse myself in the world of documentary. And, you know, can I make my, you know, can I get a free hotel room? So put me on a panel. So, you know, but it really is that I don't want to do one to the exclusion of the other.
Okay. Well, so then the natural question for me to follow up on, for both of you, is let's define you both as narrative filmmakers for a moment.
Yeah.
But at the same time, let's go more deeply into the question of why nonfiction is interesting to you. Let's talk about that in a more substantive way for the audience to understand sort of what a creative person gets out of that and why it's intriguing.
In documentary, I mean, there's this Zola quote, I'm sure people have read, a corner of nature viewed through a temperament.
Say it again.
A corner of nature, art is a corner of nature viewed through a temperament. So the idea is that you're viewing it through your lens, you know, and I think for me, the documentary, you are viewing it through your particular eyes, and you're telling a story that no one else would tell, even if if you took any of you to the same village in the Arctic I went to, you'd all tell your own versions of that, and they would all be different films. And that's kind of fascinating to me, because you impose your will and your vision and your ideas, and it's in what you leave out as much as what you put in, and you're making choices all the time as a filmmaker about how to construct the story, who to focus on, all those decisions. But and that's kind of the essence of being a director, I think. But in fiction, you're entirely controlling the world. I mean, you really are playing God. And the burden of being a fiction director is you come into a set and you could change anything. You know, you could say that table shouldn't be red, it should be blue. In fact, this shouldn't be filmed in a flat, it should be filmed in the street. You know, the actors should sit like that, or they should cry at this moment. And that's controlling the world is wonderful, but it's also very, very hard. And you're kind of emulating the truth. So you're playing a big trick. You're trying to convince the audience this is truthful. So you do that by observing life, and then you bring it and think, yeah, well, when someone's told a piece of news about that, they'd fall down on the floor and cry. Do we believe that? Or in fiction, in documentary, the truth is there before you. And I was desperate for the truth to be there before me, in a way, having done fiction, having done 2 big fiction feature-length films. I was sort of desperate to see the real world and go out into the real world and have the anarchy of that, in a way, where you're not controlling it, but it's there before you and you're capturing it, and it's like a live performance, and and you've got to get it in that moment, you know. What I realized was I was really rusty, and I didn't know how to do that. So making this documentary was a massive learning curve for me, and if I made it again, I'd be so much better, because I learned all sorts of tricks of the trade of documentaries that aren't, that you don't apply to fiction, you know. For example? Well, for example, stupid little ridiculous thing. Well, one, I can see why a lot of documentary makers make films about things that have happened, like Touching the Void or Man on Wire, because you know where the inherent drama is. You know that there's an arc. You know it starts and it finishes, and it was a great event, and it had an ending. And I set out to do this documentary that was a portrait of a community. And I just set out to do it, you know, no story, no nothing. And then I realized that in the edit is the equivalent of the script writing process. So in the edit, you find the story, and the editor has to be almost like a script writer, or you do, because, and also I see why people make documentaries about competitions or something that has a natural shape, because doing a portrait is very, very hard. And I also now understand how important characters are. It's like, and stupidly, I should know this from fiction, but it's like casting. You know, you have to get the right actor. You have to get your characters who are going to illustrate that story for you. And so it took me a long time to pick up on all those things. And then really obvious things, like if you're shooting a scene, you know, within the shoot, you've got to get the close-ups and the cutaways and the coverage. And me and the cameraman, who happens to be my husband and partner, who comes from fiction, and he shoots Game of Thrones and Downton Abbey and stuff.
Oh, really?
So he was then going to this thing, and, you know, he'd shoot this scene, and he'd shoot the wide shot of the whole thing. And then we come back and I go, hang on a minute, well, you know, that person was looking bored and that person was looking interesting. We haven't got any cover. We got nothing to cut away to. And he was like, well, do another take.
It's like, this was my break from all that. I didn't want to have to do all the coverage.
So, you know, we were really rusty, but we got into the swing of it. And also that thing of asking questions along the way, that you know, in a fiction you've got the script and it does all the work for you, but in documentary, you know, you've got to, as you go along, like we were telling this story about this tiny Inuit community in the Arctic, and we came home with our rushes and we cut them together and showed them to people, and they were like, well, we don't know anything about these people. Who are they? Where are they? What do they eat? What do they do? What do they... And we realized we had to, because they had no context, it was meaning nothing. So we had to go back and, well, we went back lots of times, but we had to start placing very carefully our context, and we didn't have any narrator, and we were determined not to have a narrator, which you put yourself in peril if you do that, because it's so much harder. But so then we were learning about the storytelling through getting people to tell us key bits of information that we could place at the right moment. So all that, you know, that was very hard.
No, that's really fascinating to hear the way you've explained it, and I want to ask Josh to pick up on that, because, yes.
I find what Sarah is saying very interesting, but it would seem to me that from what you're saying that for you doing documentaries you can be completely objective, and I think that whatever you do, there is always going to be your subjectivity injected into that, because you're going to have your own perspective that comes from your views, from your repertoire of experience, intellectual and human. So there is always going to be a subjective point of view.
I totally agree.
Comment
with that.
is about objectivity and subjectivity.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, there's no objective truth. I totally agree with that. Yeah. Yeah.
Let me ask Josh to pick up on this, because you commented a second ago that part of your own exploration of the tension between fiction and nonfiction is your being here right now. So let's, I don't want to be your therapist, but at the same time, since you're on stage and you open this up, let's work this through with you, Josh, on stage. Why? I mean, what is it about? What inspired you to say to David, before that, what inspired you to say, I really want to start exploring documentary even more, or go back to something that maybe a path you'd started down and didn't finish?
I think it's very simply, it's being out in the world more, it's engaging more, it's finding more stories, it's being able to do more short form stuff. It's being able to regulate the balance between the discovery process and the creation process.
So it really is, to your earlier comment, documentary filmmakers seem to work more, seem to create more,
Well, it's not just that they seem to create more. I mean, yes, that is true. I mean, the fiction filmmakers, I mean, unless you're really at a certain level or working in a different country, it's very easy to get stuck in waiting on actors to read scripts and getting financing, and it's
projects fall apart.
And it is not only not creative, it's certainly not intellectually stimulating, and it is certainly not the one thing that I most was interested in when I went into filmmaking, going out into the world and learning something new and engaging with real people and hearing their stories. Mm-hmm. It is none of that. I would be, it's not that I don't like the other half of the other side of the coin, which is to say, deciding whether the table is red or blue or directing an actor to do this or that. I enjoy that fully. Mm. And I do think in my film work, I find a way to balance the two things. But it is partly, a practical sense of being able to do more of it. I'll throw something out that, just to sort of pause it, I've been trying to, as you guys are talking, I'm thinking about sort of, well, what are the two sides of the coin? What does the one have that the other needs, and vice versa? And just to throw something out as a test, the documentary has the very thing that is its liability, and narrative has the very thing that documentary wants, but is also its own liability. That is to say, documentaries at their best are a process of discovery, that you go to a village at the end of the world and you don't know anything about it, and the whole point is that you want to learn about it, and you don't need a huge amount of money. You don't need to sell necessarily the world on it beforehand. You go with a camera and you turn the camera on and you discover it as you're going. Mm. It is a type of, not all documentaries do this, but it is a type of documentary. And that there is, for the filmmaker and hopefully then for the audience, there is an engagement, either emotional or intellectual or both, in the process of discovering something new. Mm. And that is incredibly enjoyable. That is also the thing that is documentary's greatest challenge, because what happens is then you come back to the edit room and you go, okay, we went there, we shot a bunch of stuff, do we have a story? Mm. And it is possible that at the most basic level, you tell the story of what you found in the order in which you found it, and so you recreate for the audience the sense of the experience of discovering that you had. That's sort of what Herzog did when he went to Antarctica, which was fun. Mm-hmm. But if you want to do something beyond that, it's really sketchy. Maybe the characters that you thought you were going to follow didn't turn out to do interesting things, or maybe they didn't have a revelation. And so the challenge for documentary is that by virtue of the open-endedness, you don't necessarily end up with material that gives you a structured driving storyline, a through line. Mm. And that becomes the greatest obstacle or challenge for a documentary filmmaker. Mm. On the flip side, a narrative filmmaker, by virtue of scripting something in advance, puts a lot of thought in advance to following Sid Field or Robert McKee's dictums, and making sure that you have certain plot points that are a very structured story. And
these are screenwriting teachers who sort of tell you there's a very specific way to write a film.
Right. There are all of these, because filmmaking has so few rules, I find that filmmakers love the rules. And so when you get onto a film set, pretty much there's only one rule that can be taught in film school in narrative filmmaking, and it's this most idiotic rule, which is that when two people are talking to each other and you can put the camera anywhere as long as you stay on one side of the line that's drawn between their noses, and that if you suddenly move the camera to the other side of them, that the audience will get confused. And you will, if you go to any student film set anywhere on the planet, you will find people arguing about whether or not the camera's on the right side of the line, because it's the only rule. People love rules. And indeed, in screenwriting, there are also these rules. And the rules enable is that you tell a story in a coherent fashion that is always moving forward, always asking questions, always revealing information. But by virtue of having done all of that work in advance, narrative filmmaking has its own liability, which is that it loses the sense of discovery. And so the very thing that enables the one is its liability, and that they are complementary. And so for me, what I'm interested in, the documentaries I love the most are ones that provide the sense of discovery, but also obviously are not boring, that they have a through line, that they can, in whatever way, whether it's an emotional unfolding or a narrative unfolding. And in the same way, I also like, it's not the only type of narrative films that I like, but I like narrative films that take me to someplace new where I feel like I can discover something new. And in the films that I've made so far, I've tried to do that. I have built in a process where I will read an article or have had a conversation with someone that will raise a question for me about whether it's what's it like to sit on an airplane at 30,000 feet for 6 hours with 80 or 100 pellets of heroin in your stomach, knowing that they might, one of them, if any one of them explodes, you will die, and how do you get through customs? Like, what is that experience? That's what motivated Maria Full of Grace. In the Albanian film, it was, oh my God, there are all these families in present-day Albania who are living under self-imposed house arrest because some member of their family went and killed someone else, and now their family is targeted to owe a life in revenge, in return. And what is that? And with that simple question of what is that about, and some idea of how that could facilitate a structured story, I then went and spent a significant amount of time doing a sort of journalistic documentarian work. And people always ask me, well, but did you, it's a shame, did you, when I do a Q&A and I tell all these stories, people say, well, did you want to make a documentary while you were doing it? Did you regret? And it's very difficult to do both. I've yet to figure out a way where I could, you know, adequately make the documentary at the same time I'm making the narrative film. But at the very least, there are two challenges for me. One is to have the sense of discovery for myself so that it's an interesting piece of work, it's an interesting process for me. And then the other is to also, in the film that I write and then can reconstruct, create also a sense of discovery. So in Maria Full of Grace, things aren't explained. Suddenly, or you learn them at the same time that the girl does them. Learns them, and suddenly she's handed a plate of grapes, and you're thinking, what are those grapes for? And suddenly they're swallowing grapes. Or in the Albanian film, you're discovering the rules of how of the codes of how these blood feuds work as you're going through the film, and so there is a mystery and a discovery and an unfolding within the context of a structured narrative film. So for me, that's how I'm trying to marry the two, is I'm trying to have both a sense of discovery and a sense of narrative structure.
But I think, you know, what's interesting about what you're saying about Maria Full of Grace, which I saw when we first met at Telluride years ago, and I thought it was amazing, was that it put you in her shoes and it gave you that experience that you probably wouldn't have got from a documentary. It would have been very hard of going through exactly what it was like to sit on that plane and emotionally feel it. I think that there are stories that are more suited to documentary and stories that are more suited to fiction. And in a way, for me, it's about the subject, and then I'll find the form. So, for example...
But is it only accessibility? Because if I told you that I could have gotten all of those real scenes in a real story, would you have preferred to see the documentary?
Well, I think the fiction works so well, I can't now imagine any other form of saying it. But I do have an example where it wouldn't have worked for a fiction film, which is that I read the same New York Times article that so many filmmakers read about the guy who was the subject of that film, The Imposter, that's come out, the documentary. And I thought, this would be the most fantastic fiction film, this man who disguises himself as people's lost children because he wants to find love, and the families who take him in because they so need their lost child that they're willing to believe that this child who isn't theirs is theirs, and there's something so extraordinary about that. And I pitched it around London as a fiction film, and for one reason or another it didn't happen. And then I saw it as the documentary, and I just thought that was so much the right form for that, because it's stranger than fiction. You know, you just wouldn't, the trick of it is...
well, that's a whole other
stranger
question.
than fiction is,
yeah. The things you can do... What are the things that you can do in fiction that you can't in nonfiction, and vice versa?
Yeah, I think there are many. I mean, what I love about documentary is you can find something that's such an extraordinary fact or sort of contradiction in someone's character, and you can put it in. Whereas in fiction, you can't. You get to the point, people go, they wouldn't do that.
that,
yeah.
right.
You know, and so we want more predictable life in fiction, mainly. Well, we want things to be what we expect. And so I think that is, there's something exciting about that in documentary, that you can really push the, you know, the genre somehow.
Well, so if we then consider everything, and this is fascinating to me, I hope it is to the audience, everything we've talked about so far, if we consider it the sort of preface or preamble to this panel, let me now go back then and ask the question that started the discussion and see how we look at this question maybe differently. And the question that is posed in the description is, what can the world of narrative features teach nonfiction filmmakers? In light of everything we've just talked about, how would you now answer that question?
Okay, do you want to go first?
You know, I feel like it's ballsy to ask it in that way. The other, I feel maybe because I'm more of a fiction filmmaker, I have no qualms about telling fiction filmmakers what they should learn. I feel like they should learn more of a sense of discovery. I feel like one of the greatest problems in fiction films is that they are pat, they are predictable, and that a greater sense of truth stranger than fiction and going outside the box.
Yeah.
That you can, that the facts of what a story are can be more surprising while the truth of what the facts are still coherent. And by truth, what I mean is people always, for me, it's a useful distinction with facts versus truth, that there is an emotional truth, that if the emotional truth is there, then you can justify and make work any narrative turn that you want.
Yeah, the emotional truth is the key. I think that's absolutely right. But I'm always interested in someone like Paul Greengrass, who's moved from making documentaries to fiction, how he, you know, there's a simple trick going on there that I've tried to emulate, and I'm going to try and do in my Suffragettes film, which is that he's using the style of documentary filmmaking with that unpredictability in the camera work, really,
right.
To make you feel that it's real and surprising, but it's actually, you know, Matt Damon doing very constructed things and it's all scripted, but there's an energy that's tricking you, that it's real, that places you in that moment. And he also, you know, often is throwing away the script a bit so that
Well, that's, throwing away the script is also gets at the answer to the question, because one of the things that you cannot do in narrative film is throw away the script, because you've spent so much time working on the script, and then there's so many people who've had to sign off on the script that then you lose another chapter in the process wherein you would have another round of discovery. So one of the things that I try and do in my feature filmmaking, my fiction filmmaking, is in the rehearsal process, have enough time with the actors to do enough improvisation that I can discover things with them that can then be incorporated into the screenplay.
So in the same way that you don't want, maybe you don't want your actors to get too attached to that script because you're worried that maybe...
Well, a theater actor will tell you that one of the greatest challenges of doing a play night after night is to continue to have the sense of discovery so that the things still feel a certain level of truth. And often actors won't want to rehearse precisely because doing it the first time in front of the camera enables a level of discovery that is not there if you over-rehearse it.
That's true. But I worked with an actor once called Peter Mullen, a Scottish actor who likes to improvise everything, and he was playing a consultant in a hospital, and he had to have, you know, these very kind of medical terms, and he made it all up. You know, he was talking about a scan, a sort of heart scan, and saying, so that bit, I was like, you can't make this stuff up. This isn't going to work. We've got a medical consultant here who walked off the film because Peter Mullen was making it all up.
He's worked with Ken Loach.
He's worked with Ken Loach, so he's into the, you know, it's all about coming from him and being very real.
The difference between Mike Leigh and Ken Loach is another element of the spectrum of the discovery process that fiction filmmakers are trying to bring in to scripted work. A lot of people assume that, you know, they look at their work, they're both realist filmmakers, and they both get these performances that feel incredibly authentic. And they're aiming their camera at subject matter that is not often captured on film. And so people assume that they're actually using improvisation in the same way. And in fact, they're quite adamant that they're very different in their process. Mike Leigh does months of improvisation before he turns the camera on. And then once he turns the camera on, nothing is improvised. Whereas Ken Loach writes an entire screenplay and then doesn't give it to the actors until they're actually filming, and then does a whole bunch of improvisation on camera, shoots in sequence, in case they discover something in a scene that will then impact what they're filming later.
There's a gentleman in the third row who wants to make a point, so I want to let you jump in. And I'm sorry, I didn't warn you that there's a microphone coming. So let's just pause for 5 more seconds until the microphone gets to you so that everybody can hear you.
Thank you. My question, you mentioned Paul Greengrass. We're talking about this, your discussion, as though there's two sides, like two sides to a coin. Is there like a larger gray area? Yeah. I think a lot of times we see in movies, especially more today, movies like, for instance, United 93, which is not a documentary, but it's a true story, which is far more closely in line with documentary than based on a true story. So how do you feel about those gray areas? I mean, how do you as filmmakers maneuver between those? Would you consider shifting from, I mean, with Maria Full of Grace, you could have based that on an actual person, and you made, you know, a specific decision to not do that. Would you ever consider going back and forth from a documentary to a more narrative piece? And how would that fit in with your film?
And let me add as a follow-up to his question, a film that I was intending to bring up anyway, which is Zero. Who's seen Zero Dark 30? So if maybe as a reference point, it might be a useful one as well.
What Zero Dark 30 and United 93 have in common that cause them to be in yet another category is that they're both based on very specific significant historical events where the adulteration or the amalgamation of events becomes very problematic, right? You say, well, would you have based Maria on one specific story? I wouldn't have, precisely because and this is where the story lends itself more to fiction than documentary, because one story might or might not have, but more likely would not have, hit all of the things that I wanted to hit, that I discovered in my research process. Because if I had hewed only to one story, then I'd have had to give up that, and vice versa. And a lot of the criticism that Zero Dark 30 gets is precisely the fact that they have, Mark Bowl, combined stuff. You know, he claims, they say, mostly for the sake of time, but and by virtue of it being a historical film, and by virtue of it being politically relevant and significant, they find it much more incumbent upon themselves, or they've simply chosen to, make a statement about the significance of their movie as a document about what's happening in the world. And as such, they've tried to draw on the authenticity factor in order to bolster that claim. And I think, I don't have an issue with the movie, but I don't disagree with the critique that they're trying to have it both ways. And I think, you know, I'm not claiming in Maria Full of Grace that I'm telling the story of what all mules go through. And by virtue of it, the fact that it's not a historical film and it's not like the world is focused on drug mules, there's not that level of attention or scrutiny. But there is a whole other level of questioning that happens when you're dealing with that subject matter.
It's such a hard thing, this, and I'm sort of slightly grappling with it with my suffragette film, because there's a story of these militant women 100 years ago who hunger striked and bombed and did various things, and then there's the woman who went under the horse. And we decided not to concentrate, not to have as our main character historical figure like Emmeline Pankhurst or Emily Warden-Davison, because we wouldn't have the artistic freedom to create the journey we wanted to create. So we've created this fictional character who kind of carries the story, and then you see the other people along the way. But then we keep on getting these notes from the American studio who's supporting it about where we're touching on history and where we're not. And it's all right if we're you know, like at the Derby, the scene at the end of our film where Emily Warden-Davison threw herself under the horse. It's fine if our fictional character is doing something that doesn't touch upon hers, but if the minute they collide, then it becomes sort of slightly dubious. And it's, what does an audience want or expect? What betrays the audience, you know, trust in a way? What steps you out of that journey? What allows you to enter history in perhaps a more visceral way through fiction sometimes than through documentary? And what are the ethics of that?
Was there a moment where you thought, oh, we will do a real person story?
We did start doing a real person
and
story.
And what would the advantage have been?
Well, in a way, you know, it's this kind of Lincoln thing. It's that, you know, if you do a biopic, you've got all that kind of weight of it. I don't know, people have heard of that person and they want to see their lives. But then you've also got the trickiness of lives don't fit into drama, or the shape of drama, you know. So I know, I was having this conversation with the producer where I said, we've got a bit of a sad ending. And she said, I don't think we should have such a sad ending. And I said, well, look, Lincoln got shot at the end. She said, some people say he shouldn't have got shot in the Spielberg film.
Right.
I don't know. But anyway, it's very complicated.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because biopics are a reflection of the same question. Because one of the greatest challenges of a biopic is where do you start and end the film? If you try to start and end the film with the birth and death of the individual, you are certainly true to the summation, that the sum of what their life was, but you have then the same difficulty that documentaries often run into, which is the arbitrariness of the narrative turns, the lack of coherence to the narrative structure. And it just feels it's too much time, it's not tight. And for me personally, when someone offers me the possibility of considering to do a biopic, I'm not interested in covering the span of an entire person's life for that reason.
But then can you find the moment that sort of is so telling, so Paul Greengrass in Bloody Sunday found an incident that summed up the whole history of that conflict just in that one day. And that's brilliant. He didn't have to tell a biopic of a character in that conflict or anything. And it's, so then it's the challenge, and they found the last 4 months.
Sunday, Bloody Sunday.
Yeah, and then they found the last 4 months of Lincoln's life or whatever it was, that summed up something, not,
some might say.
Well, yeah, some might say. So it's, it's hard to find the telling,
that's actually I watched Lincoln and I enjoyed it and I thought it was interesting. I thought, well, this is just really a story of a bunch of horse trading and politics. But I guess it's significant. And then I heard, I'm blanking on the historian's name, he's a well-known left-wing historian in the United States. And he was trying not to shoot down the movie, but by the end of the 30-minute interview, he had ticked off so many things that had been exaggerated or falsified for dramatic purposes that I felt like, why did I even watch that movie?
Because
it didn't neither represented Lincoln nor did it represent the emancipation of the slaves. Precisely because of how laser-focused the narrative
But
was.
you wanted it to, as an audience member, you wanted it to be more authentic to what actually happened because it was framed as the story of Lincoln.
If anything, I think
and you knew
one
it
of the
wasn't
ways
Oliver
of
Stone making it. You
right.
knew it was going to be.
One of the ways of framing the tension that this conversation is about is how do you do justice to a larger story while also doing justice to the demands for narrative coherence and tension.
Yeah.
And so how does Oliver Stone get away with it then? When he makes
Does he get away with it? Sometimes he doesn't. Interestingly, Oliver Stone was the other half of the radio show, talking about his 10-part series.
His history of the United States.
I think it's a lot about setting up expectations, isn't it?
Okay.
That I kind of think the trick in filmmaking
Spielberg
is,
versus Stone, we expect different.
and even, comes down to the kind of very detail when you're setting up a film. I'm sure you've discovered many times, in the first 5 minutes, you have to, you either have to slow the heartbeat of the audience or rise the, you've got to get them into they've got to know what they're in for, somehow.
Well, let's open up to some more questions from the audience. We have a microphone, and so comments, questions, responses, reactions to some of the things that we've been talking about so far. And we're letting the audience sort of settle into the notion of questions, because I threw it out to you very quickly. So, who has a question?
What? We were supposed to do something?
There's a microphone here so people can hear you.
I don't really have a question. It's just your discussion made me think of the movie Fargo and the Coen brothers, and I think it started out saying these events are real or based on true events. So what's the difference between Fargo and Lincoln or Zero Dark 30?
That's interesting.
I certainly don't. I wonder if people in North Dakota know what those events were. Was it a really well-known story?
It was not. Apparently those weren't true events. They just said it in the movie.
Oh, really? Well, they've got license to do anything, though, haven't they? I mean, it's
Coen
like
brothers?
Tarantino. I mean, you can do anything, and you'll get away with it, and you're in this kind of heightened world, and you're being played with, and I think... Yeah, and also if stories aren't high profile, as you said, they don't come under the same scrutiny, and you get away with
Does
things.
Zero Dark 30 start by saying based on real events?
I don't think it does.
I'm trying to remember.
Certainly doesn't have any cards at the end.
It doesn't need to,
No,
probably,
no.
but it's always interesting when people choose to, sometimes I feel like it's just, I immediately don't want to watch the movie when they say based on true events, because I feel like they're already struggling to say, this is important, you know, and this is a movie that you should really want to see. And I feel like the simple fact of it being based on or inspired by real events shouldn't somehow, you know, because I'm as interested in seeing a really compelling narrativization as I am seeing a really compelling a documentary that turns out to be entirely made up.
No, it is interesting when you think about it from that perspective, because, I mean, okay, we'll take a certain category of movies off the table for a moment, but I don't know if it would be weird to see that phrase in front of Avatar, for example, but putting that aside, most movies that are based in some sort of, you know, reality of some sort, you know, that's a loaded word, are based in some sort of, you know, or attempting to achieve some sort of authenticity,
sure.
or you know, based on true events of, you know, general human interaction, perhaps. But I agree with you in the way that it can just sort of set you off when you see that at the beginning.
We had long discussion when the people who did the DVD for Maria Full of Grace put on the DVD cover based on 1,000 true stories.
Did they? Wow.
Which really gets to the heart of that question, you know. It's like,
what did you think of that?
I didn't love it, but I hated it less than based on a true story.
Yeah.
A true story.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I was suddenly thinking about your question about what can, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. No,
just quickly about what can narrative
We have time.
filmmakers bring to documentaries. I think that when you see something like Man on Wire or The Imposter or Touching the Void, where people are using narrative techniques from fiction, I personally like that. When people are you know, some people feel betrayed by it and don't like it, but people use fiction techniques to recreate things and create tension and tell a story like a thriller or whatever, but to apply it to a documentary subject. I get quite excited. James Marsh's work, I think, is really exciting in that way, that he's using fictional.
So with the Sarah Polley film, it's
which
hard to speak about because you don't want to ruin it for people who haven't seen it. But it certainly plays with that, and it manages. I think the question of expectations is vital, because I think if you set the audience's expectations correctly, then audiences are tremendously willing to blur the line.
Yeah.
It's when you've told the audience you're going to give them one thing and then give them the other that they get angry because that they feel duped.
Yeah.
So JFK, Oliver Stone is claiming to give you something, but Steven Spielberg and Lincoln is claiming something else. Sarah Polley in her new film points at what she's doing at a certain point in the movie so that you don't feel like she's hiding something from you, and you feel like, okay, she's being honest.
Yeah, it's the honesty thing, isn't it? Yeah.
And it doesn't in any way diminish the power of what she's done or what's come before, because she has done something that has moved back and forth across the line between, you know, document and creation or recreation. But because she's been honest about it, I don't think there's any discussion of like that she's somehow pulling the wool over there. It's not controversial. And audiences are entirely with it, so to the extent that I've heard people talking about it.
Anybody seen the Sarah Polley film yet? I didn't know it played last night, but it's playing
sounds
again.
great,
It's called
Stories We Tell.
Stories We Tell.
Yeah.
I highly recommend it, especially if you're engaged in what we're talking about today. I think it'll be really interesting for you, so please try to see it this weekend. Let's go to the question here.
Yeah, I'm curious if you ever feel guilty or, I guess, more troubled by the need to create a semi-fictional storyline to please the audience, to like give them something exciting to watch, knowing that by creating this storyline, you're sort of not telling the full story.
Yeah.
And then, you know, sort of veering from the documentary, which maybe wouldn't be as exciting if it were really more true.
Yeah, I think that is a huge problem for filmmakers. I personally have enormous problems with that, when you're compromising the truth in order to squeeze it into a narrative, and you're constantly thinking, okay, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable here? How much can I omit that detail? You know, and is this a truthful representation? And am I conning my audience, and is it dodgy ethically? And I think, you know, and I haven't had much experience with documentary, but every time I've touched it, I've had that dilemma massively, and usually you don't have that with fiction. You know, you can do what you like.
You know, where I've come across it in both of my films, And in both cases, it had to do with the passage of time. It was the fact that the more truthful, or the more factual, I should say, representation of what would have happened would have been that a lot of time would have passed. In the case of Maria Full of Grace, the truth, the fact of many of the interviews, all of the interviews that I did with people who were drug mules, was that they had spent a long time trying to get work, not being able to feed their families, really struggling, having their back up against the wall before they finally got to this point where they decided to do this really risky, dangerous, illegal thing. And I felt like it was really, really important, both for the question of the sympathy of my character, and also, it may seem idiotic because it was a fiction film, out of respect for all the people who told me their stories, to represent that a drug mule as someone who has no concern or takes this decision lightly or loses their job 1 minute and a week later they're signing up to be a drug mule. And so there's this, it's literally probably 20 seconds of the movie, and it's a question of like, do I create a montage? There was supposed to be a sequence where Maria was knocking on doors and going to look for work, and then I was like in Columbia, like, well, how do people find work? And it's not like I was like, I refuse to do the sequence where she opens the paper and circles, because that's not what happens in Columbia, and it's a trope that I've seen too many times, and ultimately it went away because I couldn't find a truthful way to film it, and once we got into the edit room, it didn't matter, and there were enough other truthful moments that I realized that there were other ways to represent how seriously she was taking that decision. And the same thing came up in the Albanian film, which is that these stories, these families stay shut up inside their houses for years and years on end. And they don't necessarily take the law into their own hands. They don't necessarily go and do something huge and explosive, but that's what a narrative movie wants. And interestingly, that question of time is also relevant in the biopic question, right? That what's more interesting in a biopic, I think, is one where the time is constrained, because it's intimately related to the question of tension, the Alfred Hitchcock ticking clock. And when too much time passes, then you lose the tension. In a documentary, you can get away with it more because you can simply put up a card saying 3 months later, 3 years later, and jump immediately. But it is, I think for me, it's not the only, but the other being the ending, the question of an ending, falsifying an ending, creating an ending where guns come out or something explodes because it's more of a spectacle. So I think those would probably be the two areas where things get falsified. But interestingly, time is really a factor.
Yeah.
Good point. Let's take another question from the audience, and we'll go here.
You guys talked for a while about script writing and the issue of like having a script versus improvising more. And then you also sort of mentioned how a lot of narrative scripts get signed off on over and over again. And then you said that the main issue with fiction filmmaking is the sense of discovery. So I was wondering if you thought that sort of narrative design by committee sanded down the sharper edges of the script and sort of limited that sense of discovery, because I think, and then you talked about The Imposter and how that works so well as a documentary, and do you think that was because that character, the imposter, I can't remember his name, but he was so vivid as a character and that couldn't really be recreated in a narrative?
I think that, yeah, that's right. He couldn't be recreated. He was better in real life than you'd ever manage to do. But I think that watering down and that locking up is that's the problem about the collaborative process. At its best, it's fantastic. Filmmaking, as we all know, a hugely collaborative process, and at its best, it creates something better than you'd ever imagine. And at its worst, it's writing by committee, filmmaking by committee, and it gets diffused and diluted and becomes nothingy and dull, which we see lots of. So it's, and in documentaries, I think usually the team have more control. There's less money involved. You've got more creative control. There's less at stake. And as a result, it sometimes comes up with much more exciting work.
But documentary has its version of that. I've noticed that frequently a filmmaker's first documentary will be their best.
Yeah, often. Or filmmaker's first film will be their best.
Well, but
Fiction.
in documentary, the reason for that is, well, it's similar in fiction, but in documentary, it's because they became interested in something and they started filming it and they spent years filming it. And they had the time to discover something. And things happened and they filmed hundreds of hours of footage and then spent years in the edit room. And it was that sense of discovery that gave us a story that we had never seen before and a feeling of learning or experiencing something that we had never experienced before. And then the film goes on the festival circuit and has a great life, and immediately the BBC or HBO, or worse, the Learning Channel or National Geographic, calls them up and says, we love your work. We would love for you to make a documentary about X. Fishermen in Alaska, or ice truckers in Australia. And we have this format, and could you go and give us a 42-minute hour on this subject? And what happens is the filmmaker gets on a plane, paid for by the channel, and they go and they do a bunch of research, and they come back with a treatment, and the treatment includes a list of 6 or 8 potential characters, from which hopefully 4 or 5 will make it to the final cut, and then they're given enough budget to go and shoot for 30 to 45 days at most, and then they're given exactly 2 months in the editor. Everything's and so the whole element of discovery that made their first film wonderful is entirely sucked out.
Yeah.
And then what happens is, so in effect it's scripted in advance and scripted in the edit room, and all of what you just described happening in the narrative process sands down the edges of the documentary.
Yeah. But there's also a kind of a self-consciousness that comes once you've done your first film, that you've kind of been at festivals and seen audiences watch it and realised, oh my God, it's going to be seen, and that is a huge inhibitor for all future work. But I agree with you, yeah, that taking money is a two-sided coin.
It's interesting to pick up on what you just said, though, also the idea that, and maybe there's a bigger discussion here, about how the way a filmmaker responds to an audience responding to their work can then influence their future work.
Yeah.
Because your relationship to your work changes, totally. I would imagine, not being a filmmaker, when you're suddenly thinking about the audience in a much more direct way, because you've seen them.
But you can visualize them, yeah. I mean, I think learning to listen and when not to listen is one of the key arts of directing, on, when to take feedback and when to reject feedback. And I mean, I always think there's such my partner was just the other week shooting a film about the Queen, a short film with Emma Thompson, and they were trying to decide what nightie she would wear to sleep in. And Sky was involved. They were having all these conversations with all these ridiculous about what nightie she'd wear, and they found out someone rang up her secretary.
She'd sleep in the raw.
She doesn't sleep. She wears an M&S, Marks and Spencer's nightie. But then they decided that just wasn't what we imagined, so that they couldn't do that. But you get into these ridiculous questions on every level in fiction filmmaking. Everybody can have a piece of the pie and get involved, and so that's where it all gets very confusing. So
what did they decide to use then?
I can't remember what they did. It looked M&S to me. Yeah.
Okay. Did you have a follow-up to that?
Yeah, I did. So then, sort of as a natural follow-up, I think, then how do you struggle to retain creative control over a narrative or a documentary film after your first one is so successful and they say, here's $1 million, go, make us this in 30 days.
You change your name to Quentin Tarantino.
yeah, you become bullish, and you have to. It's just about confidence, really, isn't it? My God, it's being bullish, but it's scary as well, because you get blind. I mean, I'm sure anyone who's done anything creative knows snow blindness, and or that blind process where you can no longer see your own work, and you no longer know what's working, and you genuinely do want to hear what people think, and you are genuinely influenced by it for good reasons. So it's. But I think you have to just be powerful.
I mean, which isn't to say that you want to not listen to audience. I mean, that's the older question about film and where film resides between art and means of communication. Film was taught in communications departments for a reason. because what you're doing is communicating with an audience. And so you do test screenings, whether they're studio run or they're small screenings for friends, trusted friends, to figure out whether what you're trying to communicate is in fact being communicated.
Yeah, your intention, yeah. There was a good moment at film school where Stephen Frears, who was teaching me, was watching a film made by a friend of mine, and he said at the end of it, "That's the most boring film I've ever seen in my life," because he always spoke his mind. And the student went, "Well, that's what I wanted." And he went, "Then it's a triumph." So it's all about the intention, what you want.
Who else has a comment or a question? Yes, hi.
Hi. I really appreciate the distinction that you made between fact and truth. And the comment that you made about emotional truth reminded me of Herzog's idea of ecstatic truth, and that he describes it as a deeper, essential truth, like in poetry, that you have to feel. You can't explain or describe it or articulate it, but that it's inherent to cinema and it has to be sort of felt. And that's sort of what I hear you describing about your film, is that although it's fictive, that what you're trying to evoke or emote is this deeper essential truth of the experience of people who the film's not directly about or based on, but that truth sort of comes out in the film. So that's one comment. And then my other comment to you is your opening really resonated with me. I went to USC film school, went to graduate school, and I always wanted to be a documentary filmmaker. So the first day of the program, they asked a show of hands, how many people here want to be the next Steven Spielberg or George Lucas? And pretty much everybody but me raises their hand. And at that point, I felt maybe I'm in the wrong place, But what I found afterwards was that all of those classes that I thought were maybe irrelevant at the time, acting for directors, where they actually force you to be an actor so that you can experience what it's like for your talent. All of the screenwriting, all these kind of classes really then later helped me in my documentary work in a way that I couldn't have imagined going in. I probably would have avoided it if I could have, but I'm glad now that I didn't. So I think that there's so much trade-off between the two,
And maybe another way, just to circle back around to the frame question for the panel, would be, should is really the wrong, because there's plenty of people who are doing it. It's not like it's not being done. But that the challenge is for fiction film to have more facts and for nonfiction film to have more truth. In the sense that when fiction films make stuff up too much, they tend to do it because they're conforming to expectations, they're trying to sell tickets, and they're following a formula or a struck pattern. And they've blinkered themselves to the facts of the real world, which often can surprise us and make, in fact, for things that are both for more discovery and also for learning stuff that is outside our, it's if you read the newspaper that presents your worldview, you're never going to have any sense of discovery. It's why listening to the radio is interesting, because you're constantly being fed stuff that you wouldn't otherwise run into, right? And so in that respect, there are all these facts coming at you that open your mind, and they're surprising, and you're discovering things, and that has a joy that I think, especially commercial, studio, Hollywood fiction filmmaking, closes itself off to too much. It gets the emotional truth right, in the sense of they're very interested in making sure that the emotional experience is structured and gives you a certain epiphany at a certain point in the movie, and the music does certain things, and it creates an emotional experience that they've nailed and they get it right. Documentary often will go out and shoot a whole bunch of stuff and get a whole bunch of facts, that is to say, a whole bunch of scenes, and then the challenge is to create an emotional experience, an emotional truth to it, that's not just the truth of any given scene, but has a more sum experience that gives you an emotional truth. That's being really, having a dichotomy that's more extreme than we need. But since that's what the person who wrote the program gave us.
That was our challenge.
It's a frame in which there's a lot to talk about, though, I think, and that's what's interesting about it. I think that we can take a couple more questions, and we have a microphone to hang on one sec.
In the vein of the facts, I'm just curious, from Maria Full of Grace, can you tell us a little more about what reporting went into that initially, where you went, who you talked to, how did you get that access?
Society does a really nice job of rounding up drug mules and putting them all in one place to talk to. So I went to prisons and interviewed people, both in South America and in the United States. And there were a couple interviews that were especially, I mean, there were a lot of interviews that were not necessarily helpful, but then there were a couple interviews that were like, oh my God, this person's story is amazing. And inevitably, those stories were so amazing that then I couldn't even use all of them. There was one guy that I met in a prison in Pennsylvania who was from Colombia, and I drove all the way out there and I spent 6 hours with him, and he'd only gotten halfway. He'd done it twice, and I'd only gotten through the first time, and I had to go find a motel and spend the night and come back the next day and spend another whole day with him. And to give you one example, he did his second run, he obviously got caught, that's why he was in jail. His first run, he swallowed, I can't remember anymore, what ridiculous number of drug pellets, and got to the US, had all of these crazy things happen, but among them, the person who was paying him not only gave him his money, but then suddenly declared, and we've got all this other cash that we need you to transport back to Colombia for us when you go back. And he had been told how to get his cash back by, I don't even know if there was, it's very difficult to get large sums of cash across the border. They have dogs who can smell cash. Yeah. I mean, in the same way that they smell for drugs, they smell for large quantities of cash because cash has certain sense on them. And some people say actually it's drugs because there's some 90-some% of cash has traces of cocaine on it, supposedly. I don't know. Anyway, he was going to wrap his cash. He had figured out exactly how thick the packets were going to be. He was going to wrap it in carbon paper and put it in his shoes. But if he had tried to do that with this insane amount of cash that he had been burdened with taking back to Colombia, he would have had like ridiculous platform shoes. And so the only way that he could get the cash back was to go to a pharmacy in New York, buy surgical gloves and dental floss, and proceeded to swallow balloons full of cash and go back to Colombia. And he got back to his apartment, back to his wife, who had no clue, thought she was in some other part of Colombia working, no idea that he'd gone to New York, had been a drug swallower. And he proceeded to go into the bathroom at regular intervals and come out with bundles of cash. Like he had a money tree in the bathroom. Right, that's the look on your face, right? It's like, and it doesn't fit in the movie. You know? So talk about things that, you know, things that you have to leave out.
That's amazing.
But then there was a whole other level of journalism that had nothing to do with the drugs, that had to do with me figuring out what it's like to be a 17-year-old girl in Colombia and the rose plantations and all of that. So it was all sorts of hanging out and talking to people, basically.
How did you find that guy in Pennsylvania to begin with?
I found him through the guy who plays the guy in Queens who helps the girls. Because he himself, at that point, he claimed, I don't think it was an actual number, but I'm sure it wasn't like he was keeping track, but he said that he had shipped, in the 20 years he'd been doing it, he had shipped back 400 bodies of 400 mules back to Colombia. So he, you know, the authorities would come to him when they found bodies, and so he, and the converse was true as well. People in Colombia, if loved ones went missing, they often would end up getting his name, and he would get calls out of the blue from people in Colombia saying, my family member went to New York and I haven't heard from them in a week. And so then he would discover that they were in jail and he would report back. So he was a nexus.
We're almost out of time. There's a question in the back.
Just one question regarding budget, because I think there's always this idea that films cost a lot of money. What is the case? Is that really the case in the types of films that you work with? And what are some of the budget constraints that you face that are more frustrating?
Well, in fiction films, it depends what you're doing. I mean, this ambitious suffragette film I'm trying to do would cost a lot of money just because it's a period film and it's got huge set pieces and CGI and on it goes. And budgets are going down dramatically, hugely in the last couple of years. But in documentary, I mean, we did our documentary on a real shoestring, the one that's showing here, and just, worked between other jobs where we were getting paid for other jobs, but worked in between for no money and just borrowed equipment and, paid an editor, and that was about it. I don't know about you.
The question of budget was really significant for me in both of my movies. Maria Full of Grace, we spent more money than we, under any scenario, should have been allowed to spend. The budget was $3.5 million. This is for a movie entirely in Spanish with unknown actors that was not even originally going to be even for theatrical release. It was only going to be aired on HBO. And God only knows what HBO's model is. People speculate, and it's really hard to understand. And they're not doing that. When I first started with them, it was very clear, you have to be okay with the fact that this movie will never, ever have a theatrical release. And I had already had so many doors closed on me, I was like, great. And between the time that we started working together and my first day of shooting, for some reason, I don't know, they decided to theatrically release another of their movies, and it opened the door, and suddenly we were able to have a theatrical release. But I don't think even now, if I tried to recreate that same movie, if I tried to go to someone and say, I want to make another Maria Full of Grace, I wouldn't be given $3.5 million. And I then spent years, too many years, trying to get my next movie made, and I wrote a screenplay about, again, doing this journalistic work about an American truck driver who goes to Iraq to work for Halliburton. And so I went to Iraq, I interviewed truck drivers working for Halliburton on a base. I traveled I hung out in Jordan interviewing Iraqis because it was too dangerous to just hitchhike around Iraq. I went all around the United States interviewing American families of truck drivers to understand that side of the story. And wrote a screenplay for a company whose business model is normally to make $8 to $10 million movies. And they were the ones who had commissioned the script. And lo and behold, I came back with a script that they loved, but because the very nature of it involved a war zone and trucks full of oil, and the obvious threat is that they would get blown up, so you have to have, I had 2 sequences where trucks are getting blown up. The budget came in at $18 million. Oh. And I was one of the first really painful learning experiences in my career was they kept saying, they use this idiotic phrase in Hollywood. They say, we want to make the next Josh Marston movie, as if you're a brand, as if it's blowing wind up your skirt, that you are the next auteur, right? And I would say, okay, well, for me, what I hear when you're saying that is that you want to make a realist movie where it feels like these are real human beings. And then they're like, but with actors, right? With stars, right? And I went through this hellish period of trying to cast the movie, and I had my list of actors that I was interested in. They had their list, and there was a little bit of overlap, and we got through those 6 or 8 people. None of them, and because I wanted to be realistic, I wanted to go to the Middle East to shoot it. None of those actors wanted to go to the Middle East. None of them wanted to, some of them had already made a movie vaguely about the Middle East. God forbid you should do it twice. And we got to a point where we got through the list of overlap, and I said, well, the next actor I really want is Chris Cooper, who's won an Oscar. And they said, well, we were thinking more along the lines of Mel Gibson or Tom Cruise. This is after Mel Gibson has had his huge anti-Semitic rant. I'm a Jewish filmmaker. I'm supposed to take him to Jordan.
That's a documentary, actually.
That is.
So glad at least I get some comic material out of this painful years of my life.
You're doing this very well, Josh.
I ended up in Albania is what I did. I mean, the movie never got made. A week ago, I was on the phone with an agent from CAA who, I'm trying to make a new movie, and I said, I'd love for you to read the script. And he said, absolutely, I'd love it, and he referenced this script, which people in Hollywood know. And it's like, it's one of these blacklisted scripts that never gets made. And there were other movies as well that didn't get made for other reasons, but they don't relate so much to this. But that was the frustration, is I wanted to do something that was in my wheelhouse, that was dealing with this question of doing something that felt real and was discovering something, but was also narratively constructed and had explosions and payoff. And the lesson I take away is I was foolish to turn my nose up to Mel Gibson or Tom Cruise. No, you laugh, but honestly, I think that that's the challenge you take on if you're going to do that. And maybe it's because maybe I know no more now than I see now how I could have made that work. Mind you, it's not to say that they would have done it. And ultimately, what it led to then, eventually, was making this movie in Albania. And the movie in Albania was a response to this experience. It was a response to the frustration of budget. And the producer I work with and I made a conscious decision that we would seek the seed money from the same sorts of places that fund documentaries, interestingly, in order to get just enough money to go and do the discovery process. And then we made it very clear when we went out for financing that we were not showing a script, that we had a treatment, I was still writing the script, and that we didn't want to stop the train now that it had left the station, and the whole point was to create a flow in the work. And shockingly, we were able to succeed in doing that. And it ended up being easier to finance a movie all in Albanian, with an Albanian cast, about an Albanian subject matter, than it was to make any of these other movies I had tried to get made in between.
Yeah, I think you have to stick to your guns, don't you? I'm always admiring there's a few British filmmakers, we talked about Ken Loach and Mike Leigh, and there's others who do things in their particular way. Everybody knows it. There are no compromises.
Yeah, but Mike Leigh, he complains about everything. But
Andrew Arnold.
But Mike Leigh complains about not having enough money.
Yeah.
When we took the stage before this session started, we weren't actually sure whether we'd have enough to talk about to fill 75 minutes. We've actually now gone beyond 75 minutes, so we're out of time, and I think we've had plenty to talk about today. And I want to thank our two panelists for joining us. And thank you.